You're listening to the Columbia HXA podcast. I'm Clayton Smith.
And I'm Anthony Rispo. Could you hear me okay, guys?
You're good, man. Go for it.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Columbia HXA podcast. Today, Clay and I are really excited to be joined by Professor of Political Science at UNC Chapel Hill, Jeff Spinner-Halev, and Professor of Political Science at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Beth Theiss-Morse. And they have written an extraordinary book entitled Respect and Loathing in American Democracy. And we're just going to dive right into it. And I think this is going to be a very special episode. So let's say hello to our guests. So whoever would like to start, please give us some more information about yourselves and what you're doing right now in your respective colleges.
Yeah, so I am an American politics person, so I study American politics, and I'm interested in basically political psychology, which is trying to understand the psychology behind people's attitudes and behavior. And I am especially interested right now working with Jeff and another colleague of ours, Frank Gonzalez, on work on understanding equality and really trying to dig deep into understanding status and equality. So that's our next project.
That's very interesting. And what about yourself, Jeff? You're a political theorist, so you're a little bit less quantitative, if I understand that correct.
Yes, yeah, I have no quantitative skills whatsoever. Although I did go to University of Michigan, which is kind of the citadel of quantitative training in the profession, or at least was for a long time. So I am a political theorist, and I am interested in sort of large concepts of what it means to be equal in a democracy. And Beth and I were colleagues for about a dozen years or so at University of Nebraska. And I can tell you a little bit in a few minutes about how the project started, but I realized to study respect the way I wanted to do it, I needed help from a quantitative political scientist. And so I reached out to Beth, and she said, sure. And a few years later, the book came out. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I heard your first an interview of the two of you, I mentioned on a former podcast from a few months ago, and when I heard it, I was just struck by this feeling of finally people are talking about this beyond the scope of just speculation or just observation of what's been going on around us for the past few years. I mean, it's pretty obvious the divisiveness and but to put an empirical to put an empirical bent on it really solidifies what we've all been seeing. And so I'd love to dive into the book and talk a little bit about what made you think about focusing on respect, because in the book you talk about the difference between respect and tolerance. So if we can start there, and maybe you lead the way with that, so our listeners can understand, well, how did they, operationalize respect? Yeah.
Why should I respect my
Yeah.
perceived political opponents or people who think differently than me, rather than just tolerate them? What's the difference?
Right. All right. So let me just start with the origin story a little bit, and then talk a little bit about that, and then Beth will talk a little more about the distinction between respect and toleration. So I was having lunch with an acquaintance after the 2016 election, and he just said to me, "I'm sorry, I can't respect anyone who voted for Donald Trump." And I just thought, that's so interesting, because you're saying you can't respect like 48% or whatever it is of your fellow citizens, which is, a pretty incredible statement in a way, right? And so I thought, democratic theorists assume respect. Like, we just assume it. We talk about mutual respect as part of democracy all the time. So one question was, do we need respect, and why do we need respect? And another question was, do we actually, respect each other? And so that kind of, became the beginning of the project. And I'll in a minute, I'll turn to Beth, and she'll talk about the distinction between respect and toleration. But we do think respect is important for democracy, because we we need to get along in all kinds of settings. Not when we're watching, TV in our house, but on school boards, city councils, local community organizations, in Congress, in state legislatures. We have to negotiate and compromise with other people. And if we don't respect them, it makes it so much harder to do that. And so respect really is, we think, of a foundational democratic value. But that does not explain the difference between respect and toleration. And so that is Beth.
Yeah. So tolerance in political science has been defined as our willingness to give groups we really hate their basic civil liberties rights. So are we willing to give freedom of speech to a group that we really hate? Or freedom of assembly, due process, all that kind of stuff. And so that is what tolerance is defined as in political science. And you can decide that some group that you hate should have the right to speak or to hold an assembly on the state capitol steps, and still completely be dismissive of them, not pay them any attention, not listen to them, not respect them at all. And it's fine in the sense of tolerance. But I think Jeff is right that our democracy really demands something above that. We really need to be willing to respect, and we can define respect, but the idea of respect is it's a more difficult thing to give, really, in a way. But although we think it's kind of easy, but it's difficult to give, and it's something that really, I mean, tolerance is incredibly important, but I think this idea of respect is incredibly important as well.
Can you go for a little further into how you operationalized respect for this empirical work?
Yeah, you break it into two different categories. Is there an overarching definition, and how does it sort of get specific to the two versions that you stipulate in the book?
Right. So we divided respect into two different buckets, if you will. So philosophers often, there's many kinds of respect. We can think of respect in all kinds of ways. I can respect your abilities as a tennis player, for example. So one concept which we just grabbed from a philosopher named Stephen Darwell, who wrote an influential essay on this, is just called recognition respect, which, for those of your listeners who know anything about philosophy, is a very Kantian notion, which is that I respect people, I respect other humans simply because they are other humans, right? Every human has dignity that I ought to respect, and it's sort of like full stop. That's all there is to it. This kind of respect, what Darwell calls recognition respect, is, we think, really key to equality, right? Like, I respect you as a human being, and that's one of the ways in which we are equal. So the second concept of respect is a little more complex. It's what we call civic respect. And, one of the things that happened between working with a social scientist and a political theorist is Beth would say, Jeff, we need to test respect. And political theorists talk about mutual respect in a very mushy way. It's something about listening to others, but that's really kind of vague. Because what does it mean to listen? And, there are ways in which you can operationalize it, which we did. But there are three parts to our definition of civic respect. And so first, it does mean listening, but in both in an interpersonal and impersonal way. So reading about something is, on our count, listening. If you're a liberal and you read the National Review, for example, that would count.
Or listening to a podcast.
Or listening to a podcast, right? So it could actually be listening, but we're sort of like, expansive in how we think listening. Partly because we don't think people actually talk about politics very much with other people who disagree with them. I mean, it happens occasionally, but it's not very often. And so second, it means listening or understanding without assuming the worst about the person who is talking, or about the person that you're thinking about. So, if we think the worst, if we assume all Trump supporters are like Trump in some way, right? That is assuming the worst about them. Assuming you're thinking about Trump in the way that I think many people on the left do think about Trump. And of course, Trump gives us reason to not like the guy because he's, for all of his personal characteristics. And the third one is that civic respect assumes that citizens who vote differently do so it means not assuming that citizens who vote differently than you do is because they're poorly informed, ignorant, or misled. And we found this to be quite common in our focus groups. Do you have anything else?
So then, to operationalize it, which is hard, right? Because these are big, expansive ideas. We tried a lot of different questions. We actually ended up trying different questions over time. So we did several different surveys, and we would try one set of questions the first time and realize, okay, that's not scaling as well as we would hope it would. And so then we'd, try a different set of wordings. And we made distinctions between kind of abstract respect. So, what do you think about respecting other people overall? Or, anyway, so it's more abstract. And then we applied it to opposing partisans, so those in the other party. And, through these measures, you can see that respect drops quite a bit when you apply it to opposing partisans versus believing in it in the abstract.
Right. So most Americans believe that we should respect opposing partisans.
Other people.
They believe in respect
Yeah.
when you ask them in a very sort of abstract way. But when you ask them, do you respect people who voted for the other candidate, then it drops a lot. So there's a gap between sort of our first order beliefs, if you will, and our second order actual, the practice of the beliefs.
Right. And just out of curiosity, did you notice a difference ideologically between liberals and conservatives? Well, I should say I did. I am getting this from the book because I know you did, but I wanted you to talk about it more. Because I found it quite interesting. What was the difference between, and you guys lump Democrats and liberals, like ideology and partisan affiliation, into the same categories. And I think you note that even though that's not a perfect like one-to-one correlation, it's close enough to be useful. So Democrats / liberals, conservatives / Republicans, who tends to struggle with respect for the opposite party more?
Yeah, so what we found is that liberals tend to believe in a broader understanding of equality, and in particular, the idea of equal respect. So they tend to believe in that more. Than conservatives do or Republicans do, but they have a harder time it's a little complicated, but basically they either have a harder time or are the same as Republicans when it comes to applying respect to the opposing party. And because they believe in it more, that means there's a bigger gap between their belief and their behavior. And so we call that the liberal respect paradox, because they tend, and this specifically is about recognition respect. So this belief that we should really believe that every person has kind of moral worth and dignity, and we should respect that. It's not true in civic respect. So there is no gap between liberals and conservatives on civic respect. Both have a really hard time with it, but on recognition respect, Democrats just believe in it more and have a harder time applying it to opposing partisans. And this especially came through in our focus groups, where it was really clear that people had a hard time with it.
Now, I'm wondering if we can break this down a little bit conceptually or philosophically, just to click on perhaps why that could be. You talk a bit about egalitarian theory, and how I guess it seems more to skew on the left side of political, of liberal philosophy. It seems like this could be a missing link of information for people to understand, in terms of how and why liberals think the way they do as compared to conservatives. Could you give us a little bit of a snapshot of egalitarian theory and how that kind of loads onto liberalism, and how that could potentially be driving their, maybe we're inferring a bit much here, but like how that could maybe be driving their sort of levels of respect or the types of respect that they give to conservatives? I mean, the more moralizing, uh, sort of we'll get, like I said, we'll get to the moralizing part, but just to click on the egalitarian theory part a bit more to unfold that. Would you mind doing that a little? Because it was
Sure. Yeah.
interesting.
I'll talk about that a little bit. So one thing that's not so
Yeah.
much in the book that I'll just begin with is that when we asked liberals what equality meant, we're really struck about many liberals talked about a fence or a wall, and a tall person, a shorter person, and a shorter person still, and how strict equality meant that the other two people couldn't see, but equity meant that they needed to have boxes, and therefore everyone can then see over the fence. We didn't realize at the time that must have been a meme on social media, because we're old people that don't really look on social media as much.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that meme. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's obviously
Yeah.
pervasive, because we were like, after the fourth or fifth time, we're like, something's going on in the world that no one has, like, let us in on. So really what we're talking about is this move from egalitarian theorists that equality isn't just treating people the same as in the view of like, well, we won't discriminate and everyone has the right to vote, but it is tied to this idea of social justice, or undermine or attacking, trying to get rid of structural injustice / structural racism, and that there's something deeper going on than just me treating other people respectfully or equally, but that we all need to do something to change the structures, because our structures are responsible for this injustice. It's not just individual behavior. So if I treat you well, but the structures are biased toward white people or toward men or toward white men, that is not going to end the injustices that are pervasive in the world. And I think what struck me, what struck both of us, is that this is discussed in the political theory literature, but so many of our focus group participants also talked about this, kind of spontaneously, in so many ways. Let me rephrase, our liberal focus group participants. And then we did ask the second round, and much to our surprise, a lot of conservatives accept the premise of, in our surveys too, accept the premise of social injustice and structural injustice. But what they don't think is that government is government is responsible for changing it. They're skeptical that government can do good things in all kinds of ways. So anyway, so egalitarianism has moved from just me treating you equally to the structures have to treat people equally as well. And so it's become this sort of structural theory, and the only way to change that is so individuals have to band together to change the structures. So it's not just about an individual acting in isolation. It's individuals acting in concert with other people to change the structures that produce all kinds of injustices.
Yeah. So you have the more egalitarian, Rousseauian sort of, the group is under a sort of social contract where any imposition or any infraction to the order of, is considered a taboo. You can't, you're in a group, you have to be in it to win it. Whereas like the conservatives seem to have a more deontological sort of true north. Here are the rules of the road, and as long as we all follow them, we have a free society, democratic society. But liberals tend to be more diffuse in the way they ascribe meaning to their moralizing. I mean, I would love to get into that, unless Clay, you have something on your mind. It seems that moralizing would be an interesting topic to go into, but I want to give you a chance to chime in.
Actually, I was going to kind of touch on something. I wanted to ask something that's very related to that. I think it leads into it very well, which is you briefly mentioned, Jeff, this. You kind of touched on it as you were explaining the last subject was. There seems to be a lot more overlap. People tend to agree. Like the example used was structural racism, or I should say structural inequality of various kinds, right? Conservatives agree that that's a thing by and large, it seems, and so do liberals. So I think that would surprise a lot of people that there's that overlap, right? Because we tend to think of conservatives going, oh no, that's a bunch of BS, and liberals as being, really bleeding hard about it. But the disagreement is in the method of how we should address it, or whether we should even address it, right? At least on the level of government. So I guess my question is, why is it the case that they cannot see that they both agree on this thing and maybe come to a compromise? I assume the answer is lack of respect, maybe. But also, are there specific issues that are so moralized, to your point, Anthony, that they're like causing a roadblock for everything else that would be kind of low-hanging fruit for us to compromise on?
Right. So I'm going to let Beth speak about moralization. But before I do, let me just interject that I do think conservatives have a different attitude about injustice. I can't remember the question about divine,
Oh,
about
yeah.
God. Do you
Yeah,
remember
yeah,
that?
yeah. I do.
Do you remember the answers there? So conservatives are just more willing to live with injustice in the world and
Mhm.
than liberals do. Conservatives are also more likely to think that if you live an unjust life, you will, retribution will come to you in the afterlife, right? Um,
Yeah.
and we have in one of our surveys we show this. And so they just have a longer view, if you will. um,
Mhm.
and they also think the government can only do so much. And if you think that human beings are are flawed, sinful, you to some degree accept certain kinds of injustices in the world as inevitable. So I think that's part of the difference of the worldview, but I think also the question really gets to the issue about what issues conservatives and liberals moralize.
Yeah. So we asked people about various social justice issues to get at what we call the social justice worldview. And the basic, I mean, so it is very true that Democrats believe in a social justice worldview more strongly than Republicans do. But Republicans don't disagree with it. They're either neutral or slightly positive. So there is a view there's a difference between the two groups, but it's not as huge as I think a lot of Democrats would believe. But the difference is that Democrats moralize the issue. That is, we ask people how much they hold their views on social justice issues as a moral issue, as a fight between good and evil, as as something that is morally part of who you are. And Democrats were much more likely to say that social justice issues were moral issues to them, moral convictions, than Republicans were. So if you think about what that means, it really is like Democrats see Republicans, and because Republicans don't hold this as a deeply moral issue, they tend to, it's not carrying as much weight. It's not as important, and that matters to Democrats. It's also the case that when we get to this idea of collective responsibility, if we hold this as a really moral conviction, social justice is a moral conviction, and the only way to get rid of injustice in our society is for everybody to work to get rid of it, then even the lack of enthusiasm among Republicans, even if they don't disagree, is taken as, well, they're not willing to fight for this, so therefore
Mhm.
they are evil, right? So it becomes this kind of a cyclical thing where we just kind of build on each other's views, and it becomes a widening when that wide expanse is not as wide as people think.
And I imagine that does a lot to explain the paradox that you mentioned before, is that the liberals want to respect everyone, but it's this conundrum of, if you view conservatives as being complicit in this horrible, bigoted, unfair sort of societal structure that is keeping people down, then their indifference, even just their indifference, to say nothing of their opposition to your proposed solutions, how do you respect that, right? How is that? Um, and I imagine, so that gets into one of the other questions we wanted to ask here is, why is it so hard for people to respect each other? I imagine that is a big part of the answer. No?
Yeah, I think so. I do want to. I'm going to ask Beth the question here, just because I don't want us just to pick on liberals.
Ah, yes. No, that is good. I don't want that either.
Right. Because initially the project was to just study liberals, but as we thought about it and talked to colleagues, we realized we needed to do more about conservatives. So Beth, tell us about how conservatives, how they moralize issues and what
Yeah,
that means.
yeah.
Yes.
So liberals moralize social justice issues, and we argue in the book that conservatives tend to moralize national solidarity issues. So
Mhm.
conservatives or Republicans are very, very concerned about our nation and being strong as a nation. And they view that as us uniting as a group to fend off any enemies out there, right? To be a strong, secure, prosperous nation, we have to just come together as a group. And that means being united. And that means actually making distinctions in the conservative view, not making distinctions among racial groups or gender groups or all that kind of stuff, because they see that as pulling us apart and we need to be united. And they moralize this view. Now, liberals also believe, just like conservatives believe in the social justice worldview, liberals believe in this national solidarity worldview. They think too that our nation needs to be strong and secure and that we need to unite as a people. But they don't moralize it. And conservatives moralize the national solidarity worldview. And the interesting thing to us is that these two worldviews, social justice and national solidarity, really come into conflict with each other completely. I mean, so the social justice worldview is that we do look at people in different groups. We have to be concerned about racial and ethnic inequalities. We need to be concerned about gender inequalities. So liberals think of this in terms of different groups, and conservatives see that as inherently undermining of our national solidarity. So the two worldviews really clash in an interesting way.
And it's interesting because independent of race, you probably see, well, I empirically, you do see that regardless of one's race, what really depends is one's political orientation. I mean, I think it at the beginning of the outset of the book, you talk about, and I was really happy to see this, that the research on political identification, orientation, and um, sort of this idea that, let me backtrack a little bit, but this idea that traditional American values inherently are racist. You have this in the symbolic racism literature by Kinder back in the 70s, and that harnessed in the American value system is indelible to it, is vitriol towards the other. But you actually see that this solidarity, this national solidarity, carries through regardless of race, as I was saying at the beginning. So it's just interesting, this you find liberals holding on to that social justice orientation, and then asserting that Republicans have this sort of animus towards the other. But then in the conservative group, you'll have quite a variety of people represented, racially. So that in and of itself is an interesting thing. Have you what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think one thing in conservative thought, and Jeff can talk about this more, but the emphasis is really on the individual, right?
Yeah.
It's not on the group so much, at least my
Mhm.
understanding is. So if the focus is really on the individual, it doesn't, there's a belief that, like, if there's racism in society, it is individuals behaving in racist ways, and we just need to get the individuals to change their behavior, right?
Mm.
It's a different way of thinking about it.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer slightly differently, which is that I think one of the things that liberals have to grapple with is the movement for politically of Latinos not voting for Democrats in quite the high numbers that Democrats have hoped and thought. And
Right.
obviously, the election is still a few weeks away, and so we're just looking at polling data, which could be wrong. And while it does seem like the majority of Latinos will vote for Kamala Harris, it's not going to be by a lot.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's really going to be like 55-45, something like that. Maybe a little more. I mean, again, that election hasn't happened. And we do know that she's struggling to reach Joe Biden's numbers with Black voters. Now, I want to be clear, the vast, vast majority of Black voters will vote for the Democratic candidate. But there is a fall off, right? And so, what's going on? And so if we just say, oh, the other side are all racists, and
Right,
yet
right.
and yet the number of people of color voting for the other side is on the increase, even if the majority still vote for the Democrat, then we know, what are we saying? What do we, what does that mean? And it's just too easy to point to racism as the main determinant. I want to be clear that we do think racism has a cause,
Hmm.
is a causal factor, and plays an important role in American politics, and plays a role in the votes of some people. But at the same time, we think it's completely wrong to say, oh, you're a Republican, therefore you're a racist. And I think if we look at the movement of people of color, that would just make it really clear to Democrats and liberals that we actually need to be a little more thoughtful about this and maybe a little more respectful. And one place to start would be to listen to President Obama's speech at the Democratic National Convention, where he talked about respecting the other side and listening to the other side, as opposed to painting everyone as racist. Because when you do that, you're just dismissing them, and you're not really trying to. And so both on a moral level, but also on a political level, it's important to figure out why this phenomena is happening, where the Democratic candidate is getting more people with education and fewer people without an education, including many people of color.
Yeah. On education, if we can segue, that there is an interesting point about college educated, and please correct if I'm misunderstanding this, but college educated liberals being more open to have discussion. Is this something?
So So what we found is in our surveys is there's some modest data that suggests, I think modest is the right word. Yeah, that college educated conservatives.
Oh, yes. Right.
Are actually the most respectful. And our hypothesis about this is that if you go to college and you're a conservative, you almost surely have some liberal friends, because you are in the minority, and so you have to reconcile yourself with that fact, right? Whereas while some liberals will have conservative friends, many will not, and many will just think, "Oh, that's my conservative friend." Like it'll kind of be the exception, or you might not even know that they're that conservative, right? They kind of hide their views. So the best anecdote, this is of course anecdote, not statistical evidence, but it's backed by some of the evidence, is I was doing a focus group with a bunch of sort of 30-ish conservatives in Raleigh. And as we're walking out, one of them looked at me and said, "Well, I play guitar in a band." And he shrugged his shoulders, like all of these guys, like they're all liberal, right? Like I'm in a rock band, right? And so they kind of tolerate me, but I have to, like, I'm living with, I'm hanging out with these people, I'm drinking with these people, I'm doing music, and so when you're the minority like that, you just have a decision to make, right? And one of them might be, well, I'm going to make friends with some of these people, and therefore respect goes that way, but it's kind of unidirectional, I think is the point.
Yeah, but it's because I think it's harder to stereotype all Democrats if a bunch of your friends are Democrats, and you can see that they differ and they disagree on some issues. Some might believe in this more and others in this more. Whereas if you never, ever, ever have friends from the other party, you don't know that there's a lot of variation. I mean, we have two huge, big umbrella parties, and people who identify with one party or the other, there's going to be a lot of variation, and yet we tend to stereotype the other party all the time. And I think it's just harder for younger Republicans to do that because they're interacting with more Democrats and realizing, hey, all Democrats are not the same.
It's so interesting. I'm finding myself wondering, like, is there was like a person or a type of person you guys could analyze or study that would be the inverse of what you just spoke about? So rather than the conservative in the rock band, like the liberal in the country band, you know what I mean? Do you have any thoughts on that? I feel like this would really cinch up this theory, as if you could find like the one guy who's like a really diehard, I don't know, like democratic socialist who works on an oil rig or something, you know?
Well, yeah, I guess that's white dudes for Harris, right?
Right.
To some degree. But I think, that would be people living in rural areas. The Democrats are living in rural, and we didn't talk to. I mean, we talked to a couple people who did live in rural areas, but they didn't have that kind of we didn't see that effect on them. Of course, the sample size is tiny, so I don't think. But yeah, I think talking to liberals in rural areas would help us get to that phenomena. And it's very likely that they're going to respect conservatives more because they're interacting with them,
I think Tim Wall's rhetoric fits this because he says, in small town Nebraska, which is very red, right?
Good point. Yeah.
Small town Nebraska, you end up not caring so much about what your neighbors' political views are. You take care of them because they're your neighbors, right? And I think that's that kind of idea, that whether even if you are liberal in a rural area, you end up needing to work with and interact with and take care of the people around you. It's about community.
But it's funny, as per really this book. I mean, conservatives, it could be predicted that conservatives would look at that sentiment as a traditional conservative community uh, approach where it's small town, focusing on each other, you know, pretty typical traditional view. But because he's Tim Walz, there's the communist quote quote, right? So I mean, then you jump to that heuristic, right? Is it kind of fits with what sort of we're saying here. Conservatives would look at a lot of that rhetoric as not that rhetoric as the community rhetoric, but the policy rhetoric as a threat to that more, like I was saying before, deontological uh, traditional American view, right? Would you say that could be a predicted what could potentially happen on the conservative side
Well,
towards
sure.
Walls?
I mean, I think that everything that we say about liberals stereotyping conservatives is the same for conservatives stereotyping liberals, right?
Yeah, I
And so
think it's
we get
important to
this.
talk about that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so I think we get what we hear a lot of rhetoric out there is that, that this idea that all Democrats are communists, right? Is
Right.
obviously that's not true, just as it's not true that all Republicans are racist. I mean, it's just not true. And so the more we practice civic respect, the more likely we are to find out that the people around us don't hold the views that we just assume that they hold.
Mm.
Yeah, I
Okay,
also
so that,
think,
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
yeah, there's a second thing I think that Tim Walz is catching on, which we discussed very briefly in the conclusion, which is that, you don't need to talk about politics all the time. Like politics
Mhm.
is in all of life, and it's actually the more political you are, the less happy and angrier you are. I mean, we know this from surveys, right? And so, you know, when you're going helping your neighbor, doing whatever, helping take care of their dog or helping them when they have to go to the hospital, you don't need to talk about the politics of the day. You can just help your neighbor. And so the less politics is central to your life, it's totally possible the more respect you can have for other people. Now, I know some people will say, but politics is very important, and I agree with that, it turns out. But nonetheless, it doesn't have to be everything. And in lots of occasions, maybe you just put it aside and look
Yeah.
at the person as
Not
a
everything
human.
is politicized. Yeah, not
Right.
everything is
Yeah.
politicized. Yeah.
So I think that leads us into, I think, a very important question that we haven't regarding this that we haven't touched on yet, which I'm sure a lot of people are thought of as soon as we started having this conversation, right? Which is, okay, we're talking about very positive things. It turns out not every, Democrat is a communist, not every Republican is a fascist, and we actually agree on a lot of things. And if we spend time with each other, we're going to be able to respect each other more. And so respect is good, yay. And I agree with all that. I'm sure Anthony does too. But what about when you actually meet a fascist or a Stalinist, right?
Yeah.
So
Mm.
obviously, I think without, before you even answer this, I'm sure there are limits to civic respect and how much we should tolerate or respect. So what are those limits? How do we identify them? What do we do when we hit them?
That's a great question. Can I just add that's for Clay and I, we run Columbia HXA. Obviously, we're doing this podcast, but that is a great question. I second that
It's
question.
the
'Cause
whole
definitely going to
point
help
of our
us.
organization is like,
Yeah.
where are these boundaries and how do we navigate them, right? It's a
Yeah,
big part
yeah,
of it.
yeah.
You want to answer me too? Okay, I'll start. Beth will finish. So, we talked about this a lot. There are boundaries. And really the boundaries are
Of civic respect.
of civic respect. Thank you. Yeah, not of recognition, respect. You recognize all people. We can make some exceptions, but
It's universal.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's universal. And
Well,
but
I'll
I
ask
can
about Ted Bundy later.
Yes, exactly. So there are the Ted Bundy,
Yeah.
the question, but those are tiny, tiny potential,
Right.
99.9% of the time it is something you need to practice or ought to. But civic respect is different, and really the boundaries are at the limits of democracy. But we want to define that capaciously, right? Which is just to say that um uh just because someone believes that there's all this election, mischief going on, doesn't mean they're undermining, they're against democracy. Really, it's about
Mm.
someone wants to deny other people the right to vote. if someone really says, democracy isn't worthwhile, like when someone doesn't believe in democracy, we don't need to grant them civic respect.
Mhm.
We don't. It's also important to understand that it may be that you have to withdraw civic respect from certain beliefs because they have some kind of, they believe in some QAnon conspiracy, right? We do not need to grant that respect, that belief respect. But they might still have other views that are worthwhile. So just because they have one view that makes them, a conspiracy theorist, doesn't mean we should dismiss them
Mm.
completely. So I know in this day and age, we're debating about who is the threat to democracy, but I mean, part of it is that we have to defend the like not we have to be careful how we define the threat to democracy. But if there is a very serious and real threat, then we ought to then that is the bounds. Now, I will say, I do believe that if Donald Trump gets elected, which is something I hope does not happen, we will have elections after him. He's not gonna end the electoral process. I do think he will do damage to our country. I don't have much doubt about that. But that's different than saying he's going to undermine our democracy or undermine the democratic
Or
process.
completely destroy our democratic
Yeah,
process.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. I just don't think that will happen.
So
Mhm.
I want to jump in on
Mhm.
the boundaries of civic respect. I mean, what we're saying is that people need to be willing to listen to and engage with people from the other party, right? To try to figure out what's going on, whether it's impersonally or interpersonally. Once you're talking to someone and you hear what they say to you, if they start spouting all of this kind of crazy ranting stuff that is anti-democratic, you can walk away, right? So, and that's what we mean by not granting civic respect, right? You've listened, but now you say, okay, now I'm going to walk away. But that doesn't mean that you don't have to. Yeah, I mean, so you can walk away from that. But that could happen even if you hear your Uncle Joe talking over and over and over again about the same issue over and over and over again. You don't have to continue to just sit there and listen every time you go visit Uncle Joe. I mean, there are times when you are going to walk away from that as well and just say, okay, I understand where you're coming from, and now I've had enough, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I think civic respect is in that sense kind of easier than a lot of people think, just because we do allow you to just say, okay, now I understand where you're coming from, and now I'm going to walk away, right? So I
Right.
think that's an important thing to throw out there.
So it's about actually making an effort to listen for the purpose of understanding. And so once you understand, once you actually have listened, you don't have to keep listening to your crazy uncle talk about why there shouldn't be any taxes or something, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, you should talk about football.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it might mean that Uncle Joe has a very reasonable stand or something that you can at least respect, if not agree with, on some other issue. So
Right.
I do think we have to be aware of kind of
Mm.
those. It's it's the world is complex.
Well, just
Um,
to be, oh,
no, go ahead,
no,
Anthony.
just to tag on to that, to give a personal example, I always think these personal examples are really good when putting them together with the empirical work because it shows that it actually lives in real life. Using myself as an example, again, back in 2020, I think I'm not alone in this feeling. Um, like I said before, I was very much so on the far end of the left side of things. And when George Floyd was killed, um, everybody was putting up the black squares right on Instagram to signal their solidarity. Um, I put up the square. I have family members who did not. And I had reached an emotional peak at that point. I think also, of course, it was the pandemic and everybody was pent up, and it's pretty obvious how that could be the case, right? But wow, I reached my point. And that's where I had my sort of fever pitch breaking point where I realized, Anthony, my goodness, you need to chill. I freaked out. I freaked out on my siblings who did not put up the black square. It
Yeah.
became a symbol of my morality, of my virtuousness. And then that's when, everything started to spiral and I started to look into the virtue signaling literature, all that stuff. And I started to recognize that, wow, am I really willing to just completely let go of the relationships I have with my family members that I love actually? Um, you know, to not recognize them as worthy of the respect that they deserve. So yeah, it just to
What-
give a personal
y-
anecdote, it reached that point for me.
that's a good anecdote, Anthony, because this
Yeah.
is like, and I want to be respectful of both of your time, because we're coming up on an hour here. But there is one more thing that I think is important to ask about, which is in the case of if I'm Anthony's brother or cousin or father or whatever, um, and he's spouting off about something that I think is crazy, or if I'm sitting down with my crazy right wing uncle and he's talking about how Trump is going to save us from the cabal of pedophiles or something, like how do you interface with that in a productive way? On a personal level, what are some strategies we can use to maybe I can't talk with my uncle, I have to walk away, but are there ways I can understand him better, more efficiently, without putting taxing myself too much, or make myself understood or open his mind?
So I think, well, two things. One is that doing focus groups is kind of a perfect model for actually practicing civic respect, because in a focus group, the moderator asks a question and can't interject their own opinions. You're just sitting there listening and trying to figure out where they're coming from. And that is, I think, a perfect model for civic respect. So you want to understand where the other side, where the other person is coming from. And then Jeff also said that Democrats should be much more eager to try to understand why, certain groups would follow Donald Trump and his run for the presidency. So
Mhm.
what's going on? Why is this happening? And again, I think it's that focus group model, which is just, let's just try to understand. I think, so if you're sitting down with Uncle Joe and your Uncle Joe is spouting off this stuff, kind of remove yourself, think of yourself as a focus group moderator and think, I want to really understand where Uncle Joe is coming from, right? Instead of judging, I want to be just listening and trying to understand, why does he think this? And I think that's an important stance to take.
Yeah, we're not focused on persuasion at all in the book,
Yeah, yeah.
because particularly interpersonal persuasion could very quickly get difficult.
Yeah.
And persuasion is actually really hard, it turns out, right? We know from lots of psychological evidence that persuasion is not an easy thing. So we don't think you should try. I mean, whatever, people make their own choices, but we don't think persuasion is necessarily going to lead to respect. So listen to your Uncle Joe, and when Uncle Joe is, when you're done with that, ask about what's going on in college sports these days, which is also very interesting in all kinds of ways. I'm serious. Like, just change the subject
Yeah.
and get off politics sometimes. Not that you should always get off politics, but get off it and talk about something else, because you're probably not going to persuade Uncle Joe, and you're going to bring all your rational arguments toward him, and you are going to be super convinced that everything you say is utterly, completely persuasive, and
Right.
it's not going to move him 1 inch.
Yeah, yeah. And in my situation, I'd recognize that you hear moralization of national solidarity beliefs, that I was really in a situation where I did not understand that the other perspective was grounded in these solidarity sentiments, I mean, these national, these sort of like more traditional sentiments about American society, and like grounding us in protection for you know the military and gun rights and protection from the government. And I just couldn't see that. So I was seeing from the other end of that. But yeah, and I know this is not an intervention book, but by all means, and you mentioned the psychology of it. For sure, my cognitive dissonance was just on high alert, like, what is going on here when I reached that point. But much to what you're saying, we often would change the topic. And then little by little, that kind of diminished the tensions, and then we would sneak in some of our views, and of course we're close, and when you have more affiliation with others, it's easier. But um, what are some things, though, just to give a little bit of your expertise on this, that listeners could walk away with? I mean, I'll give this episode also to friends who are not in HXA. What could they do to maybe regulate a little bit, or to just have a broader perspective and deal with that cognitive dissonance, if you could speak to that in the political polarization sort of realm of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there have been a lot of studies trying to figure out how to decrease the amount of party polarization in our country, right?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, political scientists are incredibly concerned about this, and especially what we call affective polarization, which is the
Right.
idea that we just hate the other side. It's not about issue differences or anything like that. It's just that we hate the other side. And so there's a lot of interest in trying to diminish that amount of polarization that we have. The problem with that literature, in my opinion, is that
Mm.
it is too structured. Like it says, the most effective way to hold a conversation between opposing partisans to decrease polarization is to have a trained moderator, who's there helping that discussion
Ah.
along. And I'm just like, when you go to Uncle Joe's house for Thanksgiving, there's no trained moderator in the room. We have to do this on just a day-to-day basis. There's also some research that says that if we had a different political structure, it would diminish polarization. So if we had a multi-party system and proportional representation, it would diminish polarization. If we had ranked choice voting, it would maybe diminish polarization, right? So there are structural things, but again, how likely is that to happen? I mean, I just
Right.
think, we're not going to change from a two-party system to a multi-party system with proportional representation. So those kinds of things are really interesting to me, but they don't get at the heart of the matter, which is that we live our life daily without, within the structure that we have. And I think that Jeff's statement that we really have to sometimes just not talk politics, shift the focus of discussion is important. I grew up in a family where my parents were of a party that I am not, and going home, it was interesting to see the difference between my mom and my dad in how they handled these differences. And my mom was just like, yeah, we can talk politics and it's fine, and I'm not going to get mad at you. My dad was much more kind of strictly partisan, and
Mhm.
I would just shift I just say, I don't want to talk about politics right now, Dad,
Yeah.
and I just shift the focus. And I think kind of, and I love my dad, and he loved me, but it's the kind of thing where, yeah, we can keep talking about this, but that's not going to get us anywhere. So let's just shift and talk about other things. And he would respect that.
Yeah, let me add a couple of things to listeners who want to know, like, you know, tell me something about me and how I could. So imagine a world, if you think everyone who's voting for Trump, and I'm assuming most of your listeners are on the liberal side, but you can think about this from the reverse. Do you really think you can live in a world if you think everyone who's voting for Trump is awful, in which nobody voted for Trump? Like what is that? What world is that?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's
You know,
really interesting.
right. So
Yeah.
rhetorically ask yourself that question. Like, do you expect a world in which 90 or 95 or 98% of Americans are going to vote for a Democratic candidate? I mean, that's just absurd on its face. And so start there, right? Start there. And then the second thing to think about is that people vote for a candidate and they vote against a candidate also, right? And so there are certain things on the Democratic side that some people just don't like, right? And they might not love Trump. In fact, we know from survey evidence that a lot of people don't like Trump. They think he is too personally insulting. They don't like his personal attributes, but they don't like Kamala Harris and what she stands for. And then you can ask yourself, and we were talking about this morning. Kamala Harris is actually just a mediocre candidate. She's not a great candidate. I think she's running a really good campaign, and I think but when you listen to her questions and people think she's too canned, that she's not really
Mhm.
speaking to people, and there's something to it. Now, I don't think that's a good reason to vote for Trump, but if we're thinking about like, think about her as a candidate. She's, and is she persuading people? And then finally, you can think about what I said before, that Democrats for a long time thought demography was destiny, that, 10 or 12 years ago, the fact that the white population was going to decrease. This was just going to mean Democrats were going to win all the elections. And the response that we can now
Ah.
say is, really? Like, no.
Mhm.
Right, right, right. It goes to the whole point about it. It really doesn't necessarily matter what your, ethnic background, your race is. If you're
Right.
conservative, you're
Right.
conservative. If you're liberal, you're liberal, and that's pretty hard hard to,
Right.
it's defined pretty empirically there.
Right.
Yeah.
And people also shift. And so this idea that demography is destiny was this weird idea that because you're a person of color, you will vote for the Democratic Party. And that's just not the case. So I think, if I'm speaking to your listeners, like think about these things. Think about the world in which everyone votes for Kamala, the Democrat. I mean, that would actually be a bad world, right? Because it means that we're all thinking alike. So if you're gonna be have a belief in pluralism and diversity, take it seriously.
Well, I think that is a really good note to end on. Take pluralism seriously, which is kind of the whole point of the book.
Yep.
Take pluralism seriously, and take each other seriously, and have respect for one another, so that you can understand one another. Well, I have to say, I will admit, only through chapter 2 at this point. I am a student, so I have a lot of other reading to do. I beg your forgiveness. However, of the 2 chapters I have read, it is really a phenomenal book, and very, very good ideas and very, very interesting information. The book is called Respect and Loathing in American Democracy. Please, if you are listening to this podcast, go ahead and pick yourself up a copy. And thank you guys both. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Beth, for coming on the podcast. It was a real pleasure.
Really, honestly, thank you. It was so wonderful to speak with both of you, and to Clay's defense, I've been throwing a bunch of different things at him about the book. So he's on chapter 2, but I've been giving a bunch of But thank you so much for being here with us today. It was really wonderful.
Thank you both.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay. Thanks.
Bye-bye.